My name is Amy Traver. I'm an Associate Professor of Sociology and of Education here at Queensborough. I'm also the coordinator of this year's 2015-2016 Kupferberg Holocaust Resource Center and Archives Colloquium Series titled Gender, Mass Violence, and Genocide. Today's event actually marks the midpoint in the series, so we've completed at the end of today 4 of our 8 events, and the series is ongoing next semester. So please don't forget about us next semester. Come and learn with all of us as we continue. So in the spirit of that midpoint, today's event will tie together many aspects of what we've learned thus far, that gender matters in the identification, experience, and memorialization of genocide. And we'll do so by examining one case, the Holocaust, in detail. 3 scholars, Dr. Azadeh Aalai, Dr. Rochelle Saidel, and Dr. Marianne Hirsch are here with us today to guide this examination. We'll hear first from Dr. Azadeh Aalai. She's an assistant professor of psychology at QCC, so one of our own. Dr. Aalai's research focuses on media framing during times of war, the psychology of aggression, violence, warfare, and genocide. Her work in these areas has been published in peer-reviewed journals, as textbooks, and with the publication Psychology Today. We'll then hear from Dr. Rochelle Saidel, founder and executive director of the Remember the Women Institute, a not-for-profit organization based in New York City that carries out and encourages research and cultural projects that integrate women into history, especially Holocaust history. Dr. Saidel is the author or editor of 6 books on various aspects of the Holocaust. She's curated exhibits on women and the Holocaust and written and lectured on the subject throughout the US and internationally for more than 35 years. Dr. Marianne Hirsch will speak third. Dr. Hirsch is the William Peterfield Trent Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University and Director of the Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality. Her many books and articles combine feminist theory with memory studies, particularly the transmission of memories of violence across generations. Dr. Hirsch is also one of the founders of Columbia's Center for the Study of Social Difference and its global initiative, Women Creating Change. Your questions and your comments will help us to conclude today's events and the first semester of our year-long colloquia series. So please join me in welcoming today's speakers.
Where do we speak from here? I'm not sure.
I always feel like my voice is very loud anyways, so the microphone kind of scares me a little bit. But hi, everyone. So I'm Dr. Aalai. Many familiar faces in the audience are from my classes, so it's great to see all of you here. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us. So I'm just going to offer an overview of sex and gender in particular and how it intersects specifically with the Holocaust. And then I'm going to talk specifically about variations and experiences that Jewish men versus women had during the Holocaust itself. I believe that the earlier lectures of the series did a really good job. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. The earlier lectures in the series did a really good job of giving the basic definitions of genocide, kind of the history of the term and that type of thing. I want to focus more specifically on the sex and gender piece and just offer some clarification. So for those of you who don't know, I'm a social psychologist, so my analysis is really coming from a social psychological perspective. So in regards to sex and gender, the way that we conceptualize it is if you think of a nature-nurture continuum, sex is on the nature side. It's the biological, anatomical differences between men and women. And gender is on the nurture side. So it's the social, cultural, psychological meanings of what it means to be male or female, for instance. So with sex, we're talking about underlying biology. So then sex roles has to do with what our biological capabilities are. Gender, again, being a social construct, gender roles have to do with cultural, societal, institutional expectations of appropriate male versus female behavior. And as we'll see in cases of genocide, and specifically with the Holocaust that we'll be focusing on this afternoon, there's a very, very significant intersection here between sex and gender and genocide itself. In fact, if we look at just generally perceptions that we make as individuals, researchers actually identify that gender operates as an overarching cognitive framework for understanding the world around us. What that means is that if we're observing or evaluating the behavior of others, oftentimes our observations are based on, is it a man or is it a woman who's engaging in this behavior? So identical behaviors could be perceived differently depending upon whether the actors are male or female. So in that way, you can think of gender as this overarching construct that filters or guides how we think about and understand the world around us. Particularly in the case of sex, what researchers have identified, there's actually 3 qualities when we encounter someone for the first time that's automatically triggered and that we notice. What the sex of the individual is, how old the individual is, and what their race or ethnicity is. The sex and age piece, evolutionary theorists believe naturally automatically occurs because that's information that we use to gauge potential threats. So we approximate, is this person approaching me male or female, and approximately how old is the person, because this helps us to determine from a survival perspective, is this individual threatening or not? So those 2 are nature-based. The third one, the race or ethnicity factor, is more a byproduct of the fact that in virtually all societies and cultures, we're indoctrinated, we're socialized to categorize people based on perceptions of race or ethnicity, for instance. Now, specifically in the case of the Holocaust, one of the overarching ideologies that we can use to understand Nazi policy is the idea of race and space. So you can think of race and space as the overarching ideology that drove virtually all of the policies that the Reich implemented. So race, of course, is this ideology that is presenting the idea of the superiority of this quote-unquote Aryan or German race. And so then the other side of that is the notion that other races, I use race in quotation, right, because this isn't scientific, other races, including the Jewish people, are inferior and thus must be eradicated to maintain the purity of that superior or Aryan race. And then the second part of it, the space aspect of the race and space ideology, is this notion of expanding territories as much as possible to accommodate the superior race and to either enslave or ultimately kill those inferior races that are threatening the purity of the German race. So if you look at Nazi policy from the perspective of race and space, you see that there is an explicit intersection with both sex and gender, for instance. So as one scholar put it during an earlier discussion this series, different horrors, same health. So that race and space policy will translate to men and women who are Jewish or part of other persecuted groups being systematically targeted and ultimately eradicated. Before I get to the specifics regarding the gendered experiences of men versus women, I wanted to talk and brush a little bit in offering an overview of what facets of genocide are universal versus what facets of genocide are specific to each historical time that it occurs. One of the facets of genocide that you can argue is universal is the way in which men and women are treated differently and traumatized in very gender-specific ways. So for those of you who were at the last lecture series, we had a very, very eloquent Bosnian survivor discussing her experiences, and something that she said that really stayed with me is she said, if you want to kill a plant, you have to kill its roots. And that really gets at the fundamental threat of families when genocidal regimes put to power their policies. So if you think of the family unit as the core from the perspective of social identity and as very significant to the larger communities, then you understand that when genocides are occurring, it's families in particular that are under threat. And then each individual within that family is facing different types of threats, and those types of threats are oftentimes determined based on, is it a man or a woman? Is it mom or dad? Is it husband or wife, daughter or brother, for instance, son, etc. In the case of the Holocaust, of course, there are also Holocaust-specific features that vary from other genocides. And some of those are the technological features and scope in terms of sheer numbers. So there's an entire machinery that drove the genocide with this particular case. Not only that, but near the end of the war, oftentimes German resources were diverted to the genocidal campaign, even though it directly interfered with the war effort itself. So near the end of the war, it's actually contrary to German war interests to continue the deportations and to continue the persecution of the Jewish people and other targeted groups. Additionally, the global reach and international community reaction in the aftermath of the Holocaust is very specific. So past speakers have attested to, of course, the formation of the UN in the aftermath of the Second World War, and then specifically 3 years after the end of the war, the specific convention that identified the definition of genocide itself and gave us now a language with which to understand and try to make sense of these atrocities. And so now genocide becomes part of international law in terms of there's an imperative for international actors to intervene when future atrocities occur because of the aftermath of the Second World War. The question of the role that rape has played in warfare and genocide, I'm not going to elaborate on too explicitly because one of our panelists will be discussing more extensively sexual violence. Suffice it to note that what I will say is, unfortunately, universally, we do see that sexual assault, humiliation, and rape oftentimes is a universal feature of both warfare and genocide. In the case of the Holocaust in particular, there has been a lot of silence surrounding this. And the reason for this is because that race and space policy, that notion of Aryan purity, led to this false sense that Jewish women, ironically, would actually be protected from those types of violations because it would be seen as criminal acts to engage in sexual interactions with them. So there's historically been this kind of cloak or disguise that because of those racial purity laws that women were not actually going to be targeted in that particular way. What the recent research is telling us is that silence surrounding those types of acts don't necessarily mean that they weren't occurring. It just means that they probably weren't being included in testimonials or documented in the same way that we saw with other genocides, for instance. But that'll be elaborated on. So I'm going to jump ahead and offer an overview of male versus female experiences. The male experience has been the dominant narrative of Holocaust scholarship. And so because of this, I'm going to be focusing more extensively on female experiences. But what I will mention specifically for males, men and women in general, once the ghettos are liquidized and they're deported and taken into camps, immediately they're separated based on sex. So there's separation, and that's part of the breaking of the foundation. So you separate husbands from wives, fathers from daughters, etc. So that's part of the psychological trauma inherent to genocides, for instance. So specifically, there are camps that cater exclusively to women, for instance. The Ravensbrück camp, which was established in May of 1939, for instance, was the largest Nazi concentration camp established exclusively for women. And when Russian troops actually liberated the camps, there were upwards of 100,000 women who were interned there. So you do see that in terms of basic organization. But especially in the beginning of the war itself, because most Jews believed that Nazis would treat men and women differently, and because they assumed at first that males in particular would be targeted, and that women and children weren't necessarily in any real danger, there were gender-specific strategies that were devised to protect and save men in particular from Nazi persecution. So early plans for migration, hiding, and escape focused more on getting men out of the country than it did women, for instance. Similarly, men were initially the first victims of the new political order, as the process of stripping Jews of their property, of their professions, etc., from the regular economy impacted males more directly. So back then you had for the most part, traditional gender norms where males were the primary providers and females were more at home, for instance. So Jewish men in particular, particularly from middle and lower classes, found themselves unemployed and were stripped of the central facets of their identity, which was their ability to provide for and protect the rest of their family units, for instance. So in terms of the female experience, what we also see is that the genocide itself was not gender neutral. So one scholar writes, gender was a factor in the destruction of the Jewish population, as Jewish women linked to the race struggle of the regime were targeted not only as Jews, but as Jewish women because they carried the next generation of Jews. So they were targeted not just based on race, but based on their sex and potential for maternity. So again, we see race and space intersecting with the specific sex roles of women in particular. And earlier speakers have really attested to many of the ways the family unit was assaulted, or future abilities for procreation were assaulted. So sterilization policies, for instance, forced abortion, sexual humiliation, which I'm sure will be elaborated on. The difficulty of surviving if you were a pregnant woman, for instance, if you had young children. The conflict of if you're hiding in a confined space with other people and you have an infant or child that's making noise or crying, for instance, that puts the entirety of the group at risk for discovery. What kinds of choices do you make in those situations in terms of protecting your kin versus the needs of the larger group, for instance? This reminds me of a recurring term that I encountered when I first started doing research at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC, which was this paradox of what's referred to as choiceless choices. This paradox of choiceless choices is basically describing the subversion of regular choice under the Holocaust. So this notion of, as a mother, do you separate yourself from your young child during the selections for a chance to survive, or do you stay with your young infant or child, even though that means being selected and driven into the chambers, for instance? Or, for instance, as a woman, do you allow yourself or put yourself in the situation where sexual coercion or assault might mean that you can get specific favors or privileges, even though it means that you're going to be exploited in that kind of way? If it enables you to provide food for your children, to get extra rations in the camps, for instance, what kind of decision do you make there? So that notion of choiceless choices, for both males and women's, that bind was there, but the specifics of the choices, the types of negotiations required varied depending on if you were male or female, for instance. And specifically in the case of how many deaths there ended up being, more Jewish women were deported to camps than men, perhaps because, at least in the early stages, men had the opportunity to emigrate or escape, or more resources were allocated to getting men out because they were seen as being immediately under threat. Women and children were among the least valuable to keep alive, particularly given the biological roles of women. So pregnant women and mothers of small children were consistently labeled incapable of work. And during selection, so basically the only way you can survive, even if it was short term, once you were deported to camps, was potentially to be selected for a work duty. But pregnant women, women with young children, older women were almost immediately identified as basically useless and marched immediately to the selections that would lead to death camps, for instance. A striking number of memoirs and testimonies also tell of women who refused to abandon their mothers and instead chose to face death with them, or similarly who refused to abandon their children. So in one example of these choiceless choices, for instance, a selection was held in 1944 at Auschwitz because Germans needed additional help in terms of work details. They gave women with the children who remained a choice. present yourself for a selection, which essentially means if you're selected for work, you'll temporarily survive at least through the day, or stay with your young children, which essentially means you'll be marched to the gas chambers. That's an example of a choiceless choice. What do you end up doing as a mother, for instance? Only 2 of about 600 mothers of young children appeared for this selection, so virtually all of the other mothers decided to stay with their children to the death. And of course, in the aftermath, and our other panelists will be talking about remembrance and testimonies, questions such as what did you do to survive oftentimes also haunt survivors. This notion of what kind of choiceless choice was made, for instance, what was negotiated to enable survival. And I'll just end with a brief description of the guilt that mothers felt after the war. So one scholar writes, the generational chain was severed most cruelly during the Shoah when the mothers survived and their children were murdered. So the main conflict leading to guilt in the aftermath was mothers who felt they had abandoned their children or been powerless to save their lives under Nazi rule. And one final quote I'll leave with, which I encountered in scholarship that really stayed with me. Nor do those who commit genocide forget that to destroy a people, one must destroy the women. I'll say that again. Nor do those who commit genocide forget that to destroy a people, one must destroy the women. So the sex roles of women as childbearers in particular led them to be uniquely vulnerable in terms of their positions. And the other side of it, from the perspective of males, is one way to emasculate and render males powerless is to target and persecute their women. So the psychological damage and trauma happens for both sexes, but the reasons are somewhat different, for instance. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ozzy, for an overview, so I can skip a lot of that and be more specific. Thank you to Amy Traver and Dan Lesham, who is the head of the center, for inviting me, and to Ozzy and Marianne for participating with me. I'm glad to be here. CUNY is my alma mater for all 3 degrees, Queens College and then the Graduate Center, so I am at home. And as you've heard, not in these words, women are basically always left out of history, at least underrepresented, and certainly during the Holocaust and its memory afterward, this is no exception. And even when women's experiences are remembered, rape and sexual abuse have really remained the last frontier in the Holocaust narrative. And this is something I want to talk about. It's a bit of a paradox because right after the war, there were some early memoirs, Gisela Pearl, for example, some films, literature, reports, talking about sexual violence, and then it all but disappeared. Now, I've been working on this particular subject for more than 10 years. I've worked on the Holocaust much longer, but on this subject of sexual violence against Jewish women during the Holocaust, and I'm coming to 2 conclusions. Number one, I think, without any scientific proof, that sexual violence was much more prevalent than we can even imagine. And, you know, we're looking for survivors, here one, there one, nobody wants to talk, so on and so forth. But this is something that happened. And just for one brief example, which I was going to mention later, but as I'm saying it, every woman that entered a concentration camp and went through the entry process was sexually violated. And I'm not going to go into details. And the other thing is, and there are a lot of people here, it's a mixed audience, but a lot of students here, you may be thinking, this is really a no-brainer, this is dumb, how could there not have been sexual violence? I mean, I just recently saw Hunting Ground, The Hunting Ground. If you haven't seen it, it's about rape on campuses. And you're all aware of rape. It's everywhere. It's in the newspapers and on the internet every day. So how is it possible that I gotta keep standing there on how to do a book and whatever, say, yes, there's sexual violence against Jewish women during the Holocaust? However, it's been a problem. It's been a really hard sell within circles of some Holocaust scholars and within Holocaust institutions that do memorialization. So you might ask why, and again, I don't have a scientific answer. Some of it is that the traditional mainstream Holocaust institutionalization of memory, it's the Nazis killed 6 million Jews. This is what we want to focus on. I've been told this. And if you want to talk about sexual violence against women, you're going over here, and we want to go here. And there are other projects on other facets of the Holocaust that have had the same problem, and some other things we can talk about. With all of these problems of trying to get this on the agenda, really not until the beginning of this century, some papers began to be presented at academic conferences, and usually there were 1 or 2 scholars, almost, I think, well, all but one I can remember, women, and mostly young, and they weren't afraid to present this topic. So eventually we asked them, we being Dr. Sonia Hedgepeth and myself, if they would like to write chapters for our book, which became Sexual Violence Against Jewish Women During the Holocaust. It came out at the end of 2010. Now, if I tell you how we decided to do this book, you'll understand that there was a lot of resistance. In 2006, Sonia Hedgepeth and I did a teacher workshop every summer. Yad Vashem in Jerusalem has teacher workshops. And we did one on women and the Holocaust beyond Anne Frank. It wasn't about sexual violence. It was just putting women on the agenda, and that in 2006 was enough of a problem. And there was a very distinguished professor of Holocaust literature who was at the conference as a keynote speaker, and he chose to attend our workshop. And my presentation was on Ravensbrück Women's Concentration Camp, which Ozzy mentioned, and I had written a book about this. And in a context of a lot of other things, I mentioned that women were raped, Jewish women were raped at Ravensbrück. And this man stood up and he interrupted me very rudely, and he screamed that Jewish women were not raped during the Holocaust. And my colleague and friend and I looked at each other and we said, we think we need to do a book about this. This was the genesis of the book. So this is really kind of how bad it was. Then we got some of these scholars, some young, some veterans, to write chapters. Then we had to find a publisher, and that wasn't easy either. And finally, Brandeis University Press, University Press of New England, which is fine, very prestigious, they accepted. And then they made some very harsh requirements when we were just about ready to go to press about what should be there, what shouldn't be there, and we were forced to take out some wonderful visuals that we weren't allowed to put in, or they were going to dump our project. We were basically ready to do it as a self-published, but we couldn't. We had 16 scholars that had signed contracts. So it hasn't been easy, and that's only 5 years ago, so you can think about that. In 2007, at Middle Tennessee State University, there was an International Holocaust Conference, and I believe that's the first time there was ever a plenary session on this subject. Since then, there have been others, and not only we, but some other scholars have presented a lot of sessions in the United States, in Europe, in Israel, and so on. Now, also as a result of the book and as some of these conferences, we've even had some articles in various media. So the subject is now more in the air, so to speak. And I wanted to very briefly mention two of our most high-profile events, which are in a way connected to this center. One of them was in 2011 at the Brooklyn Museum at the Sackler Center for Feminist Art. And a woman came there who was a friend of someone that works with Remember the Women Institute, Consolé Nishimwa, and she's a very close friend of Jacqueline Murekatete, who was here, if you heard her not so long ago. And Consolé was a victim of the Rwandan genocide and was raped when she was 14 and had never spoken about it. And somehow our panel said she wasn't going to speak, and she spoke from the floor at the end, and it was the first time she spoke, and everyone was crying, and she was crying. And since then, she's written a book and done all kinds of important things about that genocide and her experience. And the other, I see Dan Lesham standing in the back. In November 2012, together with USC Shoah Foundation, which is where Dan was at the time, Remember the Women Institute brought together a symposium of academics and experts to discuss this subject. And that was also a first. And at the end of my remarks, I'm going to show a very short video of a survivor that we made having to do with that. Another example, Yad Vashem, a later teacher conference, 2014. So I wrote to the director, don't you think it's time you did a plenary session on sexual violence during the Holocaust? And he wrote me back, surely you will agree this is not an appropriate subject for teachers in junior high schools and high schools. Well, it is a most appropriate subject. In New York City schools, they even do sex education classes in junior high school. Okay, Auschwitz Memorial. We just in the last year sent a letter with 50 prestigious signatures that said that it's time that they discuss sexual violence when they show people around and in their memorialization, and how come Block 24A, which happens to have been the bordello at the camp, they don't talk about that. And just met with someone yesterday that was there recently, a filmmaker. They don't want to talk about this. And I only have 10 more minutes, and I'm going to try to finish. So we've been criticized, and as I said, there are some positive things now. I'm going to skip most of them. We recently showed a film called Screaming Silence, and actually an Israeli filmmaker got some child Holocaust survivors who were violated to speak on film, and there are art projects going on and various things. Now, I do believe that we need to tie our work on the Holocaust and sexual violence with other genocides. I mentioned Rwanda. We just saw some of the students here talking about their Comfort Women project, and I think we really need to do this to connect in a pattern so that we know that this isn't so unique that it will be written out of history when there are no more Holocaust survivors. And there is now new documentation, fairly new, in the International Tracing Service of the Red Cross in Bad Arolsen in Germany, and there are some up-and-coming scholars writing some PhD theses on bordellos. I can't go into that, but there were lots of them. There were bordellos with forced sex workers in many of the camps, both for privileged prisoners and for the SS and for soldiers and so on. And if we have time, you can ask about it. There are other projects going on. If you ever heard of Father Deboise, who has wonderful projects, he interviews Ukrainian bystanders that saw what was going on during the Holocaust. And a lot of them say, oh, the Nazis took the pretty girls to live with them, and then they killed them, because there were all these killing fields there, but first they were made to be forced sex slaves. And there were private sex slaves for the Nazis and their collaborators, beside those that were in bordellos, and you're going to see that in a couple of minutes, one of the survivors. So why are these women not speaking? Why are they denying, hiding it? There's a Yiddish word called shanda, which is a very descriptive word that basically means shame. And it goes on today. You know, even part of this movie, Rape on the Campus, the girls don't go and say they were raped because they're ashamed to say so. Well, it's much stronger from a woman that was born in 1915 or 1920 or 1925 when things weren't as open as they are today. So let me just, Ozzy mentioned this Rassenschande law that might have helped prevent women from being Jewish women because they were the under race and there was not supposed to be sexual relations with them, with the Nazis. But first place, it's very easy for the Nazis to rape a woman and kill her before morning so that she had nothing to say about it. And that's one reason we don't have so many witnesses also. And beside that, according to some legal experts, this Rassenschande law, which was preventing sexual relations between Germans and non-Germans, is a pretty gray area because it was really about consensual sex. It really wasn't about rape. So, moving along as quickly as I can in 20 minutes, kinds of sexual violence during the Holocaust. It's just the gamut. Rape by Germans and Nazi collaborators, as well as by other Jews, in ghettos, in hiding by people that were supposed to be protecting you, by Germans and collaborators, Jewish and non-Jewish male prisoners in camps, also issues with the partisans in the woods. There were killing fields that before they mowed people down, they raped some of the women, by liberators, which is a whole other story. Ozzy mentioned basically sex for food, which means a privileged male prisoner would give you a piece of bread if you would have sex with them, and that was to save your life, but as far as I'm concerned, that's a form of rape. So I mentioned some of the other things, and again, we're always seeking witnesses or victims, so if anybody knows of anybody, do please let me know. Also related to something said before, rape was not considered a crime against humanity at the Nuremberg trials. So that's another reason this was kept quiet. And I know I'm finishing. And so really not until 1998, the Statute of Rome International Criminal Court was rape and sexual violence declared crimes against humanity. And the first tribunal that brought someone to justice was 2001 for this crime. Now, I'm going to get to the end, which is Manya Horowitz's testimony, and we're going to show that. It's only 4 minutes, it'll be okay. And you don't know Manya's name. She was a survivor. She was interviewed by the USC Shoah Foundation, and she had the courage to speak out about rape, and also she left a message that was very important afterward. And we made this clip from this long testimony together with USC Shoah Foundation, with Dan Lesham for the symposium we did in 2012. And she, very briefly, was born in December 18 in Sosnowiec, Poland, and recorded in October 1995 in Denver, where she was living. And she was in Auschwitz-Birkenau and Ravensbrück and Neustadt-Gleb, which was a work camp of Ravensbrück, other camps. And so here it comes. I think, are you ready with the DVD in a minute? All right, I have more to say, but I won't, because let's end with Manya's words. It's her message is really strong, and I thank you. Okay.
When I was in Auschwitz, again, when I was transporting from one place to the bricks when they were building, those barracks, and for us, for more people when they came in, you know, with the kettles, with the car kettles, you call them, right? And then we had to help to make sure, you know, that we make place for those people, for those victims. Then came up one of those guards and introduced me that I'm a good worker, and he looked at me and he said one to the other in German, "Sie ist schön," that I'm pretty. And he said, "She'll do different work." And he took me into his office and then to his headquarters, living quarters. So I used to clean his house. Cooking, he had a maid, but in a different house. But I was the only one down there by him in his quarters where he slept. And he has his office and all his weapons down there. I've been seeing guns. And then he said, "You're going to work for me. You're going to clean my stuff and wash. And when the maid will bring in the food, you go and deliver to me." And I did. I followed him, whatever he said, but I knew I'm in trouble because he started to touch me on the face. So I started to cry and yell. So he beat me up to death. That stems from it. And he raped me. I don't know how you call it. I didn't know even how to call it at that time. And I was screaming. I didn't care when he hit me, and blood was gushing. You should see all my scars, the discoloration on my body. And the face, I wanted to see what he's doing in the back of me, so I turned my face. Das will be das Letzte. Das Letzte means that the last one is the face. When the face will be gone, you go with the fire. He said, "You see the smoke? That's where you belong. When I'm going to see you finish. When you're going to be disfigured completely, the face." That was Auschwitz and Birkenau. In two places they did it to me. I'm leaving a message that all our people, all our survivors should follow my footsteps, and they should do this very same, to tell the story and reveal their secrets, what happened in the past to them. And that should be revealed to the whole world. They should know that was no fiction, that was the truth, and much more.
I can't.
Thank you. Thought I'd speak from up here just to vary the rhythm. I also want to thank Amy for organizing this amazing panel. I've learned so much already from being here with all of you, and thank you all for coming. The Holocaust is no doubt one of the best documented events in history. It was documented by Nazi perpetrators in meticulous written and photographic records. It was documented by victims in diaries, in journals, in images and objects that they saved, they buried at great risk to their own lives for posterity. And it was documented and is still being documented by survivors in memoirs, in oral testimonies, such as the one you've seen. And it's documented by descendants in every genre and medium imaginable, ranging from literature to film, to performance, to visual art, to museums and memorials. As the decades pass, more archival materials are appearing in people's attics and cellars. And all of these materials are deepening, and they're actually complicating our understanding of a history that we've inherited. Our contemporary responses, now more than 3 generations removed, are also, I believe, getting more nuanced and more reflective. And as new documents emerge, we struggle to fold them into our understanding of the history that we've inherited, and we struggle to respond adequately to their demands. How do we respond to stories such as the one we've just heard? What's our responsibility toward these stories? What do we owe victims of mass violence that occurred many decades before we were born? How can we carry these stories forward without appropriating them for our own needs, but also without being overwhelmed and annihilated by them, without losing courage for our own future? These are some of the questions that I've been asking myself. And as Ozzy and Rochelle have so convincingly argued for us today, the particular story of women in the Holocaust has emerged belatedly and in fragments. It's still emerging. We know that much remains to be discovered. I'm showing you here a panel from Art Spiegelman's memoir, second generation graphic memoir, Mouse. We know that, as Spiegelman's father, Vladek, said, women's experiences of persecution, of deportation, of ghettoization were much the same as men's, terrible. But we also know that there were significant differences, and also that women might have experienced these very same events differently and have responded in particularly gendered ways, and also that they might be remembering them differently and speaking about them differently. So asking the question of gender, I think, is always illuminating, even if gender doesn't appear as easily identifiable difference between men and women. In the last decades, this attention to gender and sexuality in relation to the Holocaust has entered the study of the Holocaust to serve as a lens through which to understand the particularities that we find in women's testimonies and memoirs, but also as a platform that enables these stories that have been silenced for decades to emerge through institutions like the Remember the Women Institute that Rochelle heads. So in a history, in this way, a history that has been dominated by masculine and heteronormative stories, really, can be reconceived. Sometimes the enormity of a crime that destroys entire communities, that annihilates communities, that attempts to erase even their memory, differences such as gender differences might seem trivial, it might seem obscene to even mention them. The intent was really to annihilate all Jews. So why even mention differences based on gender or class or sexuality? They might seem unimportant, but at the same time, they will illuminate which stories are told and how those stories are told. So it's always important to ask them. It's always important to ask about gender, it seems to me, because I think that if when we ask that question, new memories of the past emerge, memories that have been unspoken or even unthought, and we see that with the question of sexual violence. In the last year, my own work has focused on small stories that that are based on ordinary objects that emerge from the past in these vast archives that have not received adequate attention. So I'm going to tell you a very different small story than the story of sexual violence today. It's a story that I think helps us to imagine and respond to the memory of the daily lives of women, men, and children who were deported to, or assembled or deported to Nazi ghettos in 1941 and between 1941 and 1944. A large majority of them were in transit to concentration or death camps where they were eventually murdered, but for a short time they were isolated in these ghettos. And the way that story has become alive to me lately is through very ordinary but also quite improbable and extraordinary objects, school photos of children who are learning or posing for a group picture in these ghettos. The story of schooling in ghettos and concentration camps is a story of resistance, it seems to me. And the images through which it's come down to us, some of which were taken in the context of severe interdictions against photography and against schooling. So schooling was outlawed in many of these cases, and photography was certainly outlawed. There was no film, there was no developing material, and yet these acts of teaching and educating children were documented. So these documents are themselves proof of resistance and acts of resistance and testimony of resistance. Through these stories and documents, resistance is defined not as armed struggle, as I think we always like to think of it. Well, why did they not fight back? There are other ways that we can think about resistance. We can think of it as an effort to continue with ordinary lives, to document those lives for posterity, and I think to believe in a future. What does it take to believe in a future when everything seems hopeless? That in itself seems to me is an act of resistance. So, I want to go back here. These two images conform quite closely to the characteristic that we think of as school photos. You all have them, right? Your picture snapped at the end of the school year, in the middle of the school year. Your parents get it, they buy it. Sometimes they're individual pictures. We all have these things. And yet they show students grouped around a teacher very often, children that are assembled outdoors or in the classroom. But these seem very ordinary when you look at them. And yet, if you look at them more closely, we understand that we need to have more explanation, more contextualization to understand them. So these photos were taken in the Warsaw and the Lodz ghetto that were established for Jews by Nazi authorities. And they're two of scores of extraordinary images of Jewish school children that were taken in various ghettos, transit camps, and in hiding during the year. So what can help us understand these improbable images? The fact that they were taken and saved. If we take them together with memoirs and testimonies and stories, and with other surviving photographic images of the time, I think they can tell us a great deal about the life in the ghettos and about small and larger acts of resistance. And as these images are of teachers and students, they can illuminate the perpetuation by women and also by men of a profession that's largely associated with women, the teaching of young children. I think there's a staggering reality frames any discussion of children and schooling and photography during the years of the Holocaust, and that is that only 11% of the 1.6 million Jewish children under 16 who were alive in 1939, before the war broke out, in what was to become Nazi-occupied Europe, survived the war. Only 11% of children survived the war. For adult Jews, the survival rate was 33%. All the reasons that were just said about destroying the future. Of course, you needed to destroy the children. They were all slated for murder. Given the immensity of genocidal destruction of Jews and the special targeting of young children for the Nazis, it may have seemed odd that there were some officially sanctioned, Nazi-sanctioned schools that continued to exist for Jewish children during the war on an on-again, off-again basis in the larger ghettos and transit camps. In the Lodz ghetto, for instance, the Third Reich authorities sanctioned the continuation of both elementary and secondary education for the first year and a half of the ghetto's existence, and the schools were overseen by the very controversial leader, head of the Lodz ghetto, Chaim Rumkowski, whom you see in the middle here, surrounded by children. In the Warsaw ghetto, it was very different. There, the German officials only permitted elementary schooling during 1 year of the ghetto's existence, and no doubt that was done to free mothers for forced labor, because if you could, if your children were in school, then you could do forced labor. They never restored secondary education, but they did restore vocational schools because, of course, again, Jews were needed for forced labor, but that only for a short while. Certainly, for Nazi authorities, permitting a limited number of Jewish children to have some schooling was a part of their propaganda machine, right? Because the propaganda was, we're just relocating these people, we're treating them well, and ordinary life will continue, don't worry about anything, just come, get on the train and come with us, right? So this, and the photographs themselves of these schools that were sanctioned helped to perpetuate this myth, right? If you take a picture of it, you can send it you can actually use it for propaganda purposes. And actually, in fact, some of these pictures were taken by Nazis in order to perpetuate this myth. So these are amazing documents. The chief accountant of the Lodz ghetto, member of the Nazi Party, was an avid amateur photographer, and he was able to secure color film in Lodz, and he kept sending it back to ACFA, complaining about the quality of the red or the green or the blue. But in the meantime, he was documenting the life and destruction in the ghetto. And he took pictures of school children. When you look at these at first, you might think, well, this is, life goes on as normal. Here these kids are smiling, they're about to get food, see their little bowls. And then we have a picture of a vocational school. These are leather workers, they're learning to do leather work. So this is just documenting the benign quality of Nazi rule. But of course, if we look at them more closely, we see, are these children really smiling? What would it mean for the leather workers, for the children, the young people learning leather work, to have this high-level Nazi come into the room and take their photo when they knew that if they didn't do their job well, they would be sent to their destruction? They had to learn this. Very, very different ways of looking at these once you know the context. I think what's even more remarkable, though, than the photos that were taken in the sanctioned schools is that even when schools were closed and there was interdiction against any education of Jewish children, Jewish teachers and adults in the ghetto set up clandestine schools whenever and wherever was possible. They held makeshift, secret, underground classes. A report on schooling in the Warsaw Ghetto, which was written in 1942, for the Underground Archive, they documented everything in Warsaw and buried these documentations, said, we cannot give the number of clandestine classes or of children attending them, and nobody can estimate the figure even reasonably accurately since it has expanded without check. It's, however, thought on the basis of statistics kept by the particular schools that 20% of children attended clandestine classes, and many, again, are being taught privately. So there were 48,000 school-aged children in the Warsaw Ghetto in a study that was compiled in January 1942. So that means 9,600 pupils were in concealed classes. It's a huge number when you really think that this is just one area of the city of Warsaw, and many others were taught privately. Already 2 years earlier, in July 1940, Miriam Watzenberg, who was a teenager in the Warsaw Ghetto, wrote in her diary, there are now a great number of illegal schools, and they're multiplying every day. People are studying in attics and cellars. Every subject is included in the curriculum, even Latin and Greek. 2 such schools were discovered by the Germans sometime in June. Later, we learned that the teachers were shot on the spot and that pupils had been sent to a concentration camp near Lublin. Now, it seems to me that for ghetto inmates, the efforts to teach children, even if only minimally, and to provide them with at least some of the daily routine of schooling would reflect an impulse to render a sense of normality and ordinariness to the extraordinary times in which they found themselves. In ghettos throughout annexed and occupied Poland, adults associated with soup kitchens or with daycare centers or with orphanages used those very same spaces to create schools to educate children. And some of them brought children into their homes. They met in cellars, they met in attics. Paula Rothschild, who taught both younger children in the Warsaw Ghetto and also attended, she was high school age, so she taught children, but she also attended classes where she studied Latin, Polish, German, and history and religion. I mean, think of this. This is what she writes in her diary. These lessons were our joy, our forgetting. Outside, the storm of war raged. You could hear the groans of those dying from starvation. And somewhere in the corner of a room, 8 girls aged 13 to 15 were sitting at a table, absorbed in learning, forgetting about God's world, even about the fact that they were a little hungry, or perhaps more than a little. So within sealed ghetto walls intended to isolate Jews as subordinate and different, many teachers acted as primary mobilizing agents, transmitting knowledge and liberal humanist values that had been the core of Jewish emancipation and integration into the European cultural mainstream. They perpetuated this. This had been core values since the 18th century Enlightenment. And even though these were intended to be erased, they perpetuated them. They didn't just attempt to teach basic reading, writing, and arithmetic skills to the youngest pupils, but Janina Bauman, one of the older Warsaw Ghetto students, recalled they would also, quote, translate Horace from the Latin or toil over a theorem by Pythagoras. So Miriam Wattenberg talks about the teachers. She said the teachers put their whole heart and soul into teaching, and all the pupils study with exemplary diligence. There are no bad pupils. The illegal character of the teaching, the danger that threatens every minute, fills us all with a strange earnestness. The old distance between teachers and pupils has vanished. We feel like comrades in arms, responsible for each other. So it's in environments of extreme vulnerability, facing acts of utter dehumanization, teachers and students were determined to resist by recalling and reaffirming values from which the Nazis had attempted to remove them. And teachers risked their lives and that of their students when performing these unauthorized and prohibited acts of schooling. So you would think, is it worth it? But yes, it was worth it to them. A few of these teachers, like Stella Rhine, whom you see here, Shmuel Rosenthal, Ita Rosenzweig, have been identified by name, and the circumstances surrounding their school photos and wartime histories can be reconstructed in great detail. Some, like Paula Rothschild and Hannah Levi-Haas, who was in Bergen-Belsen, wrote moving memoirs and diaries about their experiences. But many, many other teachers who've been recalled in oral accounts or survivor memoirs and who are depicted in these surviving photos have not been identified and have disappeared from the record of acknowledgement. We will never be able to reconstruct their names. And here's where their presence in some of these photos and thus the taking and the survival of the photos themselves become all the more valuable. In doing this, in taking, amassing, and deliberately concealing and archiving evidentiary images for future revelation, all these photographers were performing acts of civil resistance. And you see here photographers who are taking photographs surreptitiously in the ghettos. Here you see the shadow of the photographer. You see people taking photos through the pocket of their coat, right? There's a hole in the pocket, and that's how he's taking photos because it's not allowed. In photographing, and then a lot of these were hidden in milk cans and buried so that we would be able to see them. 70 years later. In photographing the children, and educators and photographers were also, it seems to me, recording their own acts of courage and their own will to survive. As radical as Nazi genocidal practices were in rupturing the textures of social life in Nazi-occupied Europe, so were Jews in ghettos and camps determined to restitch some of the qualities of that life through these very small gestures that nevertheless have momentous impact, it seems to me, for us. In response to utter dehumanizations, Jews could rehumanize children through reading and learning. They could be engaged in secular learning on the interrupted path to cosmopolitan modernity, or some of them imagined alternative realities outside Europe. Here you see a child looking at the map of then Palestine. So let me just end by saying a couple of things about photography. Photographs are powerful yet deceptive media of memory, it seems to me. Powerful because they animate the past. We feel like we can touch it or hold it somehow. The kindergarten photo from Warsaw, look at the pleats and folds and how it survived. Somebody cut something out. We can feel that it's gone through many hands. And somehow by looking at the photo, we can feel that we touched those lives. It's a powerful evocation of a moment when children looked toward a future that they were not allowed to live, in which a teacher cared for them and held them in the hope that makes the present bearable. But these are also deceptive documents. Deceptive because we saw, first of all, that Nazis took them in order to deceive. Deceptive because often we don't have the context, so we can't really place them into history adequately. Deceptive because how many really important moments in our lives are not photographed? So if we can't just rely on these alone. So we have to supplement them with voices, with testimonies, memoirs, oral testimonies. So let me just read you the words of an act of teaching that wasn't photographed because it occurred not in a ghetto but in a camp in Bergen-Belsen by Hannah Levi-Haas, who was in the resistance, a survivor of this brutal camp. She said, "I regularly take care of the children. I distinctively feel that our school has become indispensable and that is the only way to revive and maintain any freshness in their souls. The vast majority of the children evince a strong desire to study, to make up for lost time. It is with cries of joy and hooray that they welcome my calls to gather together. They all settle in, and I see adorable children's faces around me on which I read both cheerfulness and concentration." So Hannah Levi-Haas survived to publish her ghetto diary, but most likely the children she was teaching did not. I started asking, what's our responsibility to these stories now in our present? I think that Hannah Levi-Haas's voice reminds us that of a moment in the past that she lived, and she describes it as a moment of joy and learning, a moment of hope. So I wonder whether our responsibility isn't to honor that moment of hope and to let it sit there in the past, not overwhelming it by what we know happened to all of those lives, but sitting for a moment with that hope that she was facing and honoring that moment of hope for this teacher and their children. It seems to me that that might be a feminist act of looking at small acts, small moments, and allowing those to reach us from the past to now. Thank you.
Yeah, so we have some time now for a question and answer. Yeah, please.
Yes, one of the things in this very valuable contribution that was not mentioned, two things. The role of women.
Excuse me, a lot of things.
Okay. The role of women in the concentration, the Nazi women. A book was recently written, Hitler's Furies, about the women. Other thing, which is very important, we think of men abusing women. Everyone in the camp was scheduled to be killed, regardless of whether he was abused or not. But today, in the 21st century, in many, many countries, women are still being institutionally abused. What better example than the president of South Africa, a convicted rapist with 5 wives? What better example than the way women are treated in most of the Arab countries? This is a shanda, as was pointed out. However, there's women's liberation. If you read the New York Times today, you can see that brainwashed teenage terrorists, who are women, have taken the role. They want to be just like the men and go and become shaheeds and kill people because of the brainwashing. One last comment. Why didn't they fight back? Professor Randolph Graham, who is one of the world's authorities on the Holocaust, whenever is asked that question, he says, why didn't they fight back? Why didn't the 3 million Red Army soldiers, well-fed, well-nourished, mighty men, why didn't they fight back? Why didn't the German POWs, millions of them, fight back? And you want the helpless Jewish people? Proportionately, the Jews fought back more than all the others.
Is there another question, or did you want to comment on the?
I mean, there were about 10 different questions and comments there.
Let's just take some questions.
So let's take some other questions. Thank you. The role of women as perpetrators, I'm not as
I can
well
say
versed
something
on.
about
If you
that.
want to
All
comment
right,
on
let's
that.
start with the first. I'm very familiar with this book, Hitler's Furies, Women as Perpetrators. Well, that book had some women as perpetrators and some who really were definitely doing what they were doing under the thumb of a man for various reasons, and a couple of others that I'm not even sure should have been in the book, like a teacher. I can't remember all the details. I read it some time ago. There were women guards in the camps. To be a member of the Nazi Party, to be a member of the SS, not the Nazi Party, to be a member of the SS, only men were members of the SS. The women were SS auxiliary. They were underneath the rule of men. They really didn't have their own agency. Yes, some of them were horribly vicious. Some of them came from a very low socioeconomic life where they really didn't have much future in Nazi Germany, and by becoming a member of the auxiliary SS and being guards in concentration camps, it gave them status, it gave them an income, and it made them very proud of themselves, and some of them were vicious. So what?
Well, if I could say, I would not want to argue that women are inherently more peace-loving than men, and that, so I would not want to argue away women's acts of perpetration during the Holocaust and other genocides. Women have participated, and I think we need to face that. In many different ways. One way would be to be a guard in a concentration camp. The other way would be to make a nice home and cook dinner for the men who are coming home from the killing fields. That's just as much a form of complicity. And I think in our day and age, I think it's especially important to think about what complicity and implication means, not just necessarily the act of killing. There are many, many ways of participating in horrendous acts.
Well, I'm not sure I would completely agree. Some of these women, and there's been some documentation from the children. I mean, they didn't even really know exactly what was going on. And there was a recent movie with two men, I can't remember. What was the name of it? The Sins of Our Fathers, I think, was the name of this film. And you know, the kids were living this really nice life on the edge of the concentration camp in a beautiful home and everything lovely. And they didn't even know, the family didn't even really know what was going on sometimes. So I'm not sure cooking dinner is exactly, you know, equal to being a perpetrator that had some agency to really carry out outrageous acts of genocide. Purple pajamas? I don't know Purple Pajamas.
Did you have a question in the back?
There's a movie, Purple Pajamas? Oh, the boy in striped pajamas. I like purple, but I didn't know. Okay. But I would like to make a movie called Purple Pajamas. The boy in striped pajamas. Yeah, exactly. That was a little, but yeah.
Is there a question there? Yeah, please.
It's a comment also on when we lower proof Hitler's theories. I think that her hypothesis is very interesting. She actually says that there was not much of a division between the home and the camp, particularly on the eastern borders, where women have been sent to colonize the occupied territories, and they had slave prisoners at home. Mm-hmm. And she documents how, you know, how repressive and incredibly cruel some of those women were.
Can you repeat the question, maybe from the mic?
Oh, it was just a comment regarding the role that women played in terms of when workers at the houses were enslaved and treated very brutally under their own thumbs in terms of the domestic sphere. So the kind of blurring of the lines between domestic and what was happening in the camps. Yeah, I think that, I mean, I would have to agree with you here in the sense that if we kind of elevate the status of women as being inherently more peace-loving or compassionate than males, then we're failing to take into account the social and cultural context and the larger institutions and systems that are promoting values conducive towards genocidal acts of violence. Those are gender neutral, actually. But many of the particular psychological mechanisms that enable perpetrators to engage in genocidal acts are specifically targeted towards males, given that warfare and genocide historically has been a male-dominated industry or system, if you will. So, yeah.
Another question?
Yeah, please.
Could you get up and ask your questions? Because not
So we
everybody
can hear
can
better.
Too bad there's not a microphone.
Okay.
My question is, seeing that Jewish people were seen as given inhumane treatment, for the women that were enslaved by the German people, were they, if the women were to have children, what would they do to the babies? Considering that they're obviously half German, so would they see them as something that should be taken care of, or something that's wild, considering that they saw Jewish people as,
Subhuman, right?
Great question.
That's a good
Well, I don't know if we have any, documentation of what happened specifically and numbers and so on and so forth. I do know there are various instances, including some of the Ukrainian bystanders that Father Desbois interviewed, and I remember some of them saying that they took the pretty Jewish women to be their sex slaves and didn't kill them right away, but if they got pregnant, then they sent them to the killing fields. For example, I mean, this is, also, on the other hand, there is some fictionalized and also at least one story that I know that's true, that a woman came to Israel after the war with a baby, and one of them was settled in a kibbutz in the communal community. Sounds silly. Okay, she settled and she had this baby, and some of the people that were there knew that this child was the child of a Nazi, and the child was very shunned and so on and so forth. So some obviously were born, but for the most part, the Nazis didn't want these, half-Jewish children, so they just disposed of the pregnant women, as far as I understand.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make 2 quick points, especially for the students in the room. That wonderful video, thank you all for your presentations, by the way. They're very helpful and very informative and fit nicely into the series of talks we've been having. But the video, Manya, that was shown, that video was made by a student. And I think it's very important for you all to realize you don't need to wait until you're professional filmmakers and you're out in the world, but your impact can start happening now. And that film was made by a student 4 years ago almost? 3 years ago?
3. And she took a 2.5-hour testimony, and we had flagged where this discussion of sexual violence was. She made this fantastic film, yeah.
And it's been shown all around the world with Rochelle, and her video is affecting audiences around the world. So we here at the center work with students all the time to help you guys find a way to intervene and to act. And I think that video is kind of one of the best student projects I've seen in terms of making an intervention. The other thing is that Rochelle brought up the ITS and the massive archives that exist in Germany and now in other places around the world that help us trace the victims and survivors of the Holocaust. And we just happen to be having a lecture on Sunday from the head of the ITS office at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. There are flyers in the back, so if you're interested, please grab one. Thank you.
Yeah, in the back, please.
I think it's interesting to also consider what the Germans did to their own women in terms of the Lebensborn program. They have, I don't know how they selected them or if they volunteered, but they probably had to be blonde. And they were hooked up with Norwegian guys because they were blonde and had the Aryan thing. What's happened to those children, I don't think they know a whole lot about what's happened to those children, but that too is
Right.
Yeah, and you alluded to rapes by many of the quote-unquote liberators. So there was a kind of systematic campaign of rape against the Russian, perpetrated by the Russian liberators, where it was basically known if you were a woman or if you were hiding any girls, don't go out on the streets when the Russian troops are there, for instance.
And it wasn't only the Russians.
Yeah, it's most
By the
well
way.
documented.
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely.
It was more pervasive, but it was not only the
Absolutely.
Russians.
I thought, yeah, please.
Well, including the United States, I mean, everybody. I mean, in the words of one survivor, it wasn't just the Russians, everybody raped.
There are documented cases of American soldiers in
Yeah, there
occupied
are.
France raping the French women, for instance, but again, not as systemic as what you see in terms of their actual pamphlets that are being distributed to Russian soldiers that are essentially saying, these women are the spoils of war.
The spoils of war, I was just going to say.
Whereas
yeah.
the American troops are getting brochures from their government that's saying, warning, STD, stay away from the women. So in terms of systemically, institutionally, there are very different values being transmitted to the soldiers in terms of appropriate behaviors in the occupied territories.
This question is for you. I'm a little confused because I know that they use propaganda to make it look like the camps were a good place, but I'm confused of why they would want to give the Jewish and the rest of the races knowledge if they want to keep them ignorant, and who were the people that was actually teaching them, and what were they teaching them, if you know?
Well, this was this was self-administered in the ghettos in Warsaw and Lodz. So the schools were run by the sanctioned ones, where the Nazis would allow education, right? They would let the Jews administer their own educational institutions. But that was for a very short time. The vocational schools were a different story because those were to create more slave labor, right? And then the clandestine ones, the ones that were secret, were obviously also done by the resistance members, organized resistance, and Jews who organized them informally. So none of them had a kind of German state education, except before before the formation of the ghettos. Does that make sense?
Were they teaching them Jewish culture or German?
Well, that's what varied. I told you they taught classics, they taught advanced mathematics, geography, history. They wanted to continue their education that they had begun. And kids were, you can imagine, they didn't want to miss years of schooling. So they wanted to keep up. So they would ask, and people would informally, math, get these 5 kids together and teach them this level of math. So it was just all, these informal schools. And it's a way, you can imagine kids in ghettos. Some were there for 2 or 3 years. You can't just keep them doing nothing, right, unless they could work. They were sitting around. So what they really most wanted to do was keep learning. So, that's what's so moving about this to me.
Yeah, please.
First off, I'd like to thank you guys for coming out here and sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you.
Because I think the best way to impart, what happened is with your knowledge. The question that I do have is, college curriculum, when you spoke about high school and junior high school curriculum trying to get implemented in the school system, what are we going to get a course in the college curriculum? Because we have it in Queensborough. We do have history of the Holocaust, but we don't have something, directed specifically to this topic. Are we even trying to get, because it is an interesting topic.
For me personally, I'm able to use my expertise on this topic in social psychology with an applied unit when we learn about warfare and genocide. But that's really kind of specific to how I frame my course. If you were to take a social psychology course with other faculty, they probably wouldn't include it. So that's more kind of to the discretion of specific faculty. I don't know if
Maybe
you could
Amy
speak
has
to, or if Amy knows.
We have an English faculty member here who addresses some of this work in her graphic novel for Great Susan. And there are other courses in English that are addressing Holocaust and genocide?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of people constructing units in their classes so they can actually, look at the center and
also in some other division classes too. I'm teaching Holocaust literature in the spring, so.
Not just specifically directed at women in the Holocaust, but women in general that suffer from this all around the world. I think it's a course that educates us on all of the events, not all, some of the major events that have taken place.
Gender and genocide.
Yes, so to that point, we have sociology of gender, if you're interested. Anthropologists also study gender in this fashion, so in anthropology we can talk about that. But we do offer sociology of gender, so that might be a course for you as well.
And that's what this colloquium series is about, trying to get the conversation started on campus. And that's why there are these 8 lectures to really spark the curiosity among the students, which is nice for students to suggest courses, but also among the faculty.
No, I mean, I think that it's a great question because it's sort of how are you going to study it is a really good question. What department does it fit in? And I think everything we've talked about here, and we represent a lot of different disciplines and different training. So I think this is a really good question, what kind of approach would be helpful. And I would say, this kind of interdisciplinary approach, I mean, you could study the literature separately from the sociology and from the psychology, but, in some ways to really get a fuller picture, you have to put it all together. And then conceptually, you have to think about what does it mean to think about gender, and how do we best think about it? And I think genocide and Holocaust are ways of raising the question, I mean, to a different level, it seems to me, right? Because every question becomes a little more urgent when these lives are at stake to this particular degree. So we may think of war, well, men, go to fight and women are home and it's collateral damage. Well, not necessarily. It's different in every different context. So I think it's really a really good way to think about these questions.
So we just reached the end of our time, but I did see one more hand, and then I'd invite you to maybe ask questions at the conclusion. Would you mind? Was there another student question? I thought I saw a student. So please, I invite you to.
The Nazis, with their scientific theories, occasionally made mistakes. And they took Jews and made them poster boys for the SS. It's a famous story. Error, E-E-R-L. There's another book, The Mascot. These were Jewish children, and the Germans mistakenly thought that they were perfect Aryans, and they made them poster boys, and then years later they came out and said, we were Jewish. You also had, as a regular policy, when the Germans would kill non-Jews, when they would kill Russians or Czechs or something, if the children looked Aryan, they would kidnap the children and have them adopted by German families. And after the war, sometimes the parents survived when they wanted their kids back. This was maybe 60 years ago in Life magazine. I remember it to this day. Das ist mein Eigen. A woman came from the Soviet Union wanting to get her child back who had been adopted by Germans. And of course the kid didn't want to go back. The only parents he knew were the Germans who adopted him.
So, Marianne, when you were talking in your comments, I kept thinking, children and youth are such a wonderful lens into this topic as well. So thank you for that comment. I think you're absolutely right that that's another perspective that we could be taking. And I hope all of you will join me in thanking our visitors. And please be reminded that the series doesn't end here. We have a whole other semester. So thank you.
Thank you.